Hello, everyone. I'm Ginny Lobel with Defined Health, which has been recently renamed Cello Health BioConsulting. Along with our co-sponsors ShareVault and Bio International, we welcome you to today's Insight Series webinar, Dynamics of Chinese Biotech Investments, Reshaping the Global Competitive Landscape. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Cello Health BioConsulting, formerly Defined Health, is a Cello Health business. Cello Health is comprised of a group of subsidiary companies offering strategic commercial advisory services and valuation and risk mitigation strategies across the development spectrum, from preclinical through phase 4 lifecycle management, repurposing and reformulation, and pre, peri, and post-launch competitive analysis for life sciences companies globally. Our team at Cello Health BioConsulting is scientifically deep, and we assist companies globally with early development and risk mitigation strategies for their compounds, platform technologies, and portfolios, as well as independent and well-regarded forecasting and search and evaluation for portfolio expansion at all stages of development. Today's webinar will be moderated by James Lee, PhD, Associate Principal, Oncology Lead, and Head of our China Initiative at Cello Health BioConsulting. Our esteemed panelists for this event are Brad Longcar, Chief Executive Officer, Longcar Investments, LLC, Guillaume Vignon, PhD, Senior Vice President, Business Development at Beijing, and Jonathan Wang, MBA, Senior Vice President and Head of Business Development at ILabs. Please send us your questions as you think of them during today's presentation, and we'll proceed we'll try to respond to them at the end of the discussion, time permitting. If we don't get to your questions in today's allotted time, we will follow up with you directly over the next several days. We do anticipate that slides and an audio-visual version of this webinar will be posted on the Cello Health BioConsulting, the Cello Health BioConsulting and Defined Health websites within the next several days. Before we get started, I'd like to bring your attention to the following upcoming events we'll be participating in, which you can see on your screens, with a special call out to the early bird discount for our 30th annual Cancer Progress Conference to be held in New York on May 7th and 8th, 2019, and our upcoming webinar being held next week on Monday, December 10th, entitled Cancer Vaccines Reimagined, From Pariah to Darling. This webinar is also free of charge, and you can find more info and register by scanning the QR code on the screen. To learn more about our events and/or Cello Health BioConsulting and Cello Health, just give us a call, send an email, or visit our website at cellohealthbioconsulting.com. Thank you, and please enjoy this edition of our Insight Series briefings. I'll turn the mic over to James now.
All right. Thank you, everyone. My name is James, as Ginny introduced us. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, what has been going on. So really, what has been intriguing the world right now is with the deal making that's happening in the China therapeutic space, and just a lot of these cross-border deals are occurring. And right here is just some examples of the larger cross-border deals that have occurred that are more of the traditional type of China deals, looking at more marketed assets, not necessarily looking at innovative assets. But as you can see, beyond that, there's all these other deals that have also been, happening this year, which greatly outnumber those marketed asset deals, by number and by quantities. Definitely very exciting. As you can see, there's things ranging from Novartis out-licensing to various biotechs to, biotechs working with biotechs, Beijing and Mirati, and also many other different things. Different players are also playing into this, including large pharma and biotechs everywhere. So moving forward, I just wanted to go to this next slide, which is really showing what's happened the last 5 years as far as licensing deals and and partnerships across the borders. And as you can see, 2018 is becoming a banner year for licensing deals. As far as the Q3, 3 quarters of this year, you already see that it's higher than all the previous years deal-wise. And also, there's a larger percentage of them being licensees, China licensees, which is driving this increase. We've also kind of predicted what it would include if we were to maintain this pace into Q4, and that would definitely put us at over 70 deals, which would be a record amount of cross-border therapeutic deals that would have been done from China's side. So what's the difference, though, between this year and last year? Though last year, the deal values would be still significantly higher than this year's, and that was mainly driven by Beijing, out-licensing their PD-1 antibody to Celgene, and also SanPower acquisition of Dendreon from Valeant. So, and also an example of how far we've come since 2014. I mean, the largest deal that was done in 2014 was Alter Biosciences, out-licensing China rights with an upfront of only $4 million, with a total deal value of $200 million. So we've come a long way, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to go beyond this. So what's driving all this interest? I mean, it looks like it's the innovative therapeutics that's really driving it, and what's driving the innovative therapeutics? It's oncology. If you look at the yellow golden box on the bottom, you can see that it's been growing steadily over the years to become larger piece of the pie of the overall deals that have been made across from China and cross borders. So as of this year, right now, we already have increased through 3 quarters over what 2017 numbers are for oncology deals, and with the expectation that there will be another 25% growth in total deal value, that in total deals that were completed, that number will continue to increase, and will, hopefully oncology will help drive the innovative therapeutics into China. So in the little blue box on the top left, just some examples of what the largest upfronts and total deal values have been for those 5 years, and this year the largest deal so far has been the Agios and CStone deal, where the total deal value is reaching almost $400 million. So moving into the next slide here, this is just kind of showing what type of assets are really part of these deals. And the biggest thing you could see in 2018 is that there's been a shift of interest from marketed or phase 3 assets and preclinical deals to more of the phase 1, phase 2 deals. And why is that? It's mainly due to the push for these near-term innovative therapeutics that are driving deal making this year, and it's been a steady growth of these earlier assets, but not too early into the preclinical, in hopes of getting some more near-term value return for these deals. So that's really exciting, and that's really showing how China has really switched their focus from looking at those marketed asset or some sort of collaboration in the preclinical space to more of what's more actionable in the near term in order to get something on the market in China. The next slide here just kind of gives a little bit of clarity on those licensing deals, from in-licensing into China and out-licensing from China, and what kind of rights are being exchanged here. So in the in-licensing deals in the last 5 years, as you can see, most of them are still focusing on China rights, with a decent amount of global rights are also being dealt into Chinese companies. While out-licensing is just a mixed bag. There's those that want to out-license global rights and also China rights. But with more granularity, you can look on the next slide here. Through the 5 years, there's definitely some significant growth in 2018 in the interest for global rights licensing into China. So in the previous 4 years, it has only been, 3 global rights deals each year. Until this year, through 3 quarters, we're already at 7. So that number is definitely going to grow by the end of this year, and will definitely be a record. And that's driven, again, by the interest of Chinese companies to expand their presence in the global market. So this is just kind of summing up, what is the future of the Chinese biotech and pharmaceutical industry? As you see on the left side, the deal-making trajectory, right now, it's really, I think it's just the beginning. I mean, you haven't really seen too much activity between 2014 and 2018, but from 2018 to 2022, I mean, that growth is going to continue to increase significantally. And that's mainly due to the influx of capital into this industry, in the expansion of capital from the public market, specifically from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And innovation is also being continually pushed by the government, which will generate continually more interest into licensing deals into China. But even with this increased growth, though, questions remain on how China, biotechs and pharma will proceed into the global stage, and some major questions that hopefully we'll address at some point during this webinar. In what ways, will they be able to, counter the lowering of the barrier to entry by global players by the recent, priority review path that's been set by the government? How will domestic Chinese players, address that concern and to this increased global pressure? In addition to that, the global market is a very competitive environment. So how are these Chinese biotech pharmas, which are new players to the global environment, be able to, demonstrate that they'll be formidable competitors in this global market? And also, what kind of challenges do they expect to face, though, when they do enter this global market? And finally, the strategies, obviously, of clinical development, business development, and how those will really drive these Chinese biotechs and pharma folk forward in this competitive environment. So now at this point, I want to hand it over to Brad to just kind of give a little bit of an introduction on the excitement into the China market.
Sure. So thanks a lot. It's great to be here this morning. Thanks for everyone for joining the call. James, thanks to Defined Health for hosting, and thanks to Jonathan and Guillaume for participating. And, I think, so I'm an investor, and I've been following the China market pretty closely for the last few years, and I think this is the most exciting thing that's happening in biotech right now. The Chinese biopharma market and industry is really transitioning into a new era, and you have a new breed of really world-class companies that are making that happen. And the two that have joined us today are examples of that. So, Jonathan's company's ILabs is developing niraparib in China, a great PARP inhibitor, and they just signed a very interesting deal with Novocure for the Optune product, and they have a whole pipeline behind that. And Guillaume's company, Beijing, has terrific assets. They have a PD-1 that might actually be best in class that's very exciting, and a BTK and a PARP, and a whole pipeline behind those. And these are world-class companies. These are on par with the companies that we're used to looking at here in the U.S. And one thing that I would point everyone to is there was a great Wall Street Journal article about multinational and foreign companies commercializing drugs in China that just came out yesterday. And Mark Mallon, the head of global strategy at AstraZeneca, had a quote in there that I think really crystallized why we're here and why we're talking about this. He said, China just as recently as a few years ago was kind of an afterthought. And he said now every drug that goes into late stage testing needs to have a China strategy. And I think that's very true. And I think it's, something that's very relevant to a lot of you who signed up on the call today. I know there's a lot of representatives from companies and business development people, and there's a wide open market in China right now for these medicines. And one thing that's a huge advantage today is that China is starting to accept foreign data for approvals there. And so it used to be that Chinese venture capital firms really focused their investments domestically on growing up companies, within the country. And now that they're able to translate data from here more easily, the ability for you all to do business development and licensing and partnering is just really exciting right now. And just kind of at a high level, how I think of this is, I've been investing in biotech for a while now, but a lot of people have told me what it was like investing in the biotech sector in the 90s when, Genentech and Celgene and Amgen and these companies were just new IPOs and new entrepreneurial startups. That was kind of the birth of our biotech sector. And I really feel like that's what's going on in China today. And it's super exciting. And I thought I'd just highlight what I think are the 4 most important things that I think are catalyzing this change. So the first thing, of course, is government support. The government of China has a program that they came out with in 2015 called Made in China 2025. And the goal of that program is, we all know of China as a manufacturing-based economy and more traditional industries like that. And the Chinese government wants to transition their economy to more value-added sectors over the long term like that. So through this Made in China 2025 program, they've highlighted industries that they want to be globally competitive in by that time. So there's things like robotics and clean tech. And pharmaceuticals is one of the industries that they've singled out, that they don't just want to be, domestically, they don't just want to cultivate their domestic market. They want to be global leaders in this. And I think they can get there if they make, the right policy changes and the right investments in this industry. And a second thing that's been hugely important is regulatory reform. So what the Chinese Food and Drug Administration, which is now called the National Medical Products Administration, joined something called ICH last year, which is a global consortium of regulators that the FDA, the EMA, and the regulators in Japan started years ago. And that was an important signal to the market that China wants to be up to global standards when it comes to regulatory issues. And they've made a lot of progress on that front over the last 3 or 4 years. For example, cell therapy, as recently as a year ago, they didn't even have an IND process for cell therapies, and now they do. They've cleared a huge backlog of new drug applications that had been filed there. They're hiring tons of professionals, and so they're really trying to model their FDA after ours. And, they're trying to have clear, tangible and transparent ground rules. And that's helping investors and companies come to grips with how to develop things there. And it's helping entrepreneurs start these companies. The other thing that's of huge importance is the change that happened at the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. I'm sure you all know about that. So until April of this year, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange had a rule that said if you don't earn revenue, you can't list on our exchange. So if you think about it, that essentially meant that there was no true biotech sector, public market for that. And just like the government realized that it's really these high value sectors that are driving global growth today, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange did as well. And they changed that rule. And already 4 companies have IPO'd, and there may be dozens and dozens over the coming years. There could be as many as literally 50 IPOs over the next 3 or 4 years. So literally overnight, they're going from having no biotech sector in the public stock market to having a major one. And the implications of that go way beyond the stock market. Venture capitalists will now have an earlier exit out of investments, and they can reinvest in startups more quickly. So that's going to create an entire ecosystem and culture of investing in biotech. So that's really an important change. And just another thing are all the entrepreneurs who are returning home and starting world-class companies. Jonathan's company's ILabs is a great example of that. It was founded by an entrepreneur named Samantha Du, who had a lot of experience working at Pfizer and places like that in the United States, and has returned home and now has started just an incredible company that, you know, is developing medicines that are at the cutting edge of science today. So I would be excited about China if one or two of these changes was happening. And the fact that 3 or 4 are happening all at the same time, it's kind of like a perfect storm. So the way that I think about this, again, is I think China's biotech sector is kind of like ours was in the 90s. I think there's a Genentech out there. I think there's a Celgene out there. I think there's an Amgen out there. And none of this will happen overnight. Like, it's not all perfect. There are still missing elements. But if you have a long-term perspective, like the government does with that Made in 2025 program, if that's the type of time frame you're thinking about this from, I just think that all the right things are happening for this to be really important in the future. So again, thanks for joining us, and I'll pass it back to James.
Thank you, Brad. That was a great introduction into the excitement in China, you know, to follow up on, you know, what is actually happening with the deals. I think, you know, this is a good time to just start the panel, and you know, I have a question directly back at Brad here, you know, to start off with. So how do you view, you know, how U.S. investors are currently looking at biotechs in China? I mean, are they thinking of them the same way they're thinking of Western biotechs, or are they thinking of them a little bit differently at this point?
I think so I'm a public markets investor. I think for most public market investors, we're still taking like a wait and see approach. You know, we're seeing all of these headlines that are happening. You know, every single morning, our biotech news is impacted and in many cases dominated by things that are relevant to China. You know, Guillaume's company, Beijing, just signed a really interesting partnership with the Canadian company Zymeworks yesterday. That was big news. And seems like there are press releases and headlines like that every single morning. And as an investor, you're noticing it, but it's a hard area to research. You know, people are still trying to come to grips with like who the companies are and what's going on. So I think from a public market standpoint, we're still trying to figure it all out. And I think that'll change, especially as there are more IPOs in Hong Kong. You know, when there's a couple of years from now, when there are a few dozen companies that are listed there, it's going to be impossible to ignore. So I think investors are getting caught up on the earlier stages. Like VCs have been all over this. Like for the IPOs that have been happening, it's been interesting to see US VCs participating in them. So the second IPO that happened in Hong Kong was a diabetes company called Hua Medicine. And Arch, for example, was one of the founding investors in that company. So the VCs have been aware of this and have been participating in a while, and you're seeing that illustrated in the IPOs that are happening today. And I think over the next year or two is when you'll see the public market and institutional investors start to really participate. Everybody's, you know, trying to hire like an analyst who's focused on this sector, and people will get caught up pretty quickly because they really have to.
Right. Thanks, Brad. No, I think, you know, the IPO market is actually, you know, very interesting, especially in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange market. You know, so actually, I also want to reach out to on the industry side, the biotech side. You know, maybe we'll go to Guillaume, who's actually in the Hong Kong IP market right now. What's your perspective, if you have any of your company perspective on Hong Kong Stock Exchange?
Hi everyone. I don't have a crystal ball. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me on the panel. It's quite nice to do it virtually. It's something new to me, but again, I'm glad to be here, and I do hope colleagues joining will get really a lot of value out of it. So as Brad mentioned, traditionally the Hong Kong Stock Exchange was basically a retail, focused business, which means, biotech, we were not profitable, could not list on that market. So you have very, very intelligent investors, but maybe not well familiarized with the biotech, let's say, risk profile. And I think, with a bit of the downturn on the stock market worldwide, people have been a bit more cautious. But on the other hand, there have been also some recent success in terms of, solid IPO on the Hong Kong stock market. So I really don't know what to think about this and how it's going to evolve. I think there's a lot of U.S. trade war, influence into the prospect of that market, which of course shed a huge cloud under the perspectives. And I don't know whether this would be a turnaround in a very short period of time. So I think this is still a good place to raise capital. And I think as we already alluded to, there are no shortcuts in our business. So you can't just take a whatever asset, bring few people around this, and then try to launch it on an IPO on Hong Kong. I mean, as I said, very, very, very smart investors in Hong Kong, and thinking that you can do that, I think is an insult to investors who are really professional in Hong Kong. So again, no shortcut. It's about quality, the depth and the breadth of the management team who's behind companies. I think if you stick to that, I think you will have always investors, listening to your value proposition.
Thank you. And then a slightly different question to Jonathan. I mean, you guys are obviously on the public market, also in Nasdaq. And I'm just wondering, in your mind, and Guillaume can also jump in on this also, is there a difference in the two markets, in how an early biotech will think of, IPOing, whether you should go for the Hong Kong market or should you go into the New York Nasdaq?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, James, for the kind invitation, and also thanks a lot, Brad, for the kind words on our company. Really glad to join this virtual panel and be here for tonight. I think to answer your question, James, I think if we first of all look at the investors who have come in a lot of the both the Hong Kong IPOs as well as the Nasdaq IPOs, actually a lot of the investors are in some ways quite similar. Even the US investors have participated in the Hong Kong IPOs. I think the Hong Kong market, at least initially, as we have noticed, has come under quite a bit of volatility, and maybe the guess is the volatility could sustain for some period of time. But I think overall it is a good thing, certainly for the industry, to have such a market open and to allow companies, especially here based in Asia, to be able to list and have that other additional avenue. For us, the reason we chose Nasdaq, that being our market, that there's a number of strategic reasons. Licensing, of course, and partnering, helping Western licensors, our partners, is a very core part of our strategy. So therefore, being listed on the Nasdaq, being at the same platform as our partners, I think really means a lot. So I think there's strategic reasons in addition to capital raising reasons, at least for Zai, to be listed on Nasdaq primarily.
That's very helpful. So I mean, there's that's the public side. I mean, but is there any comments that anyone can comment on the private investment side of this, and whether or not there's the any cross-border private investments or domestic China investments, and how they're thinking about the quality of assets in the Chinese biotechs? Anybody can comment on that, Guillaume or Jonathan?
Well, I think you have a lot of VCs who are very active in China to finance, let's say, early stage companies who are truly developing the next wave of innovation. So I think on that kind of venture arm, again, not short of cash. Again, very professional in investment managers and venture capitalists who for some of them already worked outside of China. So bringing this expertise, this founding expertise, but also guiding companies and their management to manage well the early stage and seed funding stage of their companies is crucial. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the basics are also there for private investment in China.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, do you have any thoughts on that also?
Yeah, no, look, I agree. I think, there are a lot of very sophisticated, private sector investors, also in China. And there's more and more focus, put onto healthcare, especially a lot of the, even the TMT investors now shifting and focusing on healthcare, seeing, that's potentially the next wave of growth, in China. I think, one of the maybe potential issues is, some of the rounds, especially, lately has been, the increasing valuation on the private round, in China, because I think good quality companies is emerging, but, still, in some sort of scarcity compared to the number of funds there are. So consequently, there is a lot of competition on the private side. Thereby potentially, sort of somewhat, increasing, some of the valuations. But I think, good companies, really from a long-term perspective, is very important. So, if it's the right team, then maybe that may justify some of the valuations.
Right. Yeah, definitely the valuations in China as far as the early private rounds and even the valuations into the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has been really, as an IPO for new IPOs have been really quite high versus a lot of the Western companies that we typically interact with. Back to Brad here. It's like, do you have any thoughts here on what what's the difference between China valuation in the public market or private market versus in the West?
Yeah, so the markets like public market China, like Hong Kong valuations 6 months ago were literally 3 to 4 times higher than the United States. And it's come down a lot over the summer. And there's really 2 things that have brought it down. Number one, the trade war, which I know we're going to talk about in a second. And then some like one-off news items, like the vaccine scandal that was there, really affected the valuation of all companies in this sector. And I would echo what Jonathan said. One thing I worry about is a lot of private companies there have raised their last rounds based off of those valuations from like 6 months ago. And the first small handful of Hong Kong IPOs haven't gone so well. The first company went public at $14 a share and is now trading around $8. It was as low as the 6s. And the thing I worry about is all of those private companies that raise their last rounds at these high valuations. That's usually a difficult thing, to kind of accept that if you do go public, it's not going to be, nearly what you thought it was 6 months ago. So all of that kind of needs to get sorted out. Valuations in Hong Kong today still are higher than the U.S. But, if you think about it over the very long term, the scale of the country is really hard for U.S. investors to grasp. And, the valuations there, like from a multiple standpoint, are much higher. But look at market caps. There's only like 4 or 5 public companies that have valuations that are over 10 billion. And in fact, I actually did the math. I have a pretty cool statistic that I like to talk about. So I looked at the U.S. stock market and all the pure play biotech companies that have a valuation over $1 billion. And on U.S. stock markets today, there's about 160 companies like that. And in China, just pure play, so not the pharmaceutical, but like pure play, what we traditionally think of as biotechs, right now there's 5. So China has 5 times the population. They have 1/3 of all cancer patients, for those of you that focus on oncology. And we have like, $150 billion companies, and they have 5. And that's not to say that those are ever going to even out, but it just does, I think it does go to show you like how much potential that market has if it really cultivates and turns it, from a generic space to like an innovation-based healthcare sector. So even though the multiples seem very high today, when you look at the market values of companies and what they can grow into one day, I think it's a very attractive market personally.
Thank you, Brad. That was very helpful. And actually, you're right. We should just jump into the trade war thing a little bit, because that is potentially affecting a lot of the market also. Do you have any immediate follow-up comments to that?
I do. So when I think about the trade war and how it impacts our sector and what's going on in China, I segregate it into 2 categories. So what you see in the news every day, you hear like about tariffs. There's going to be a new round of tariffs, and that actually shouldn't fundamentally impact this sector. So this spring, China actually eliminated tariffs on cancer medicines to 0. And this actually happened like a week before the trade war really kicked off. And I don't think the timing of that was accidental. I think it was kind of a message that let's not use, human health as a bargaining chip. And it also illustrates how aggressively, the country and the people there want, first-class medicines, just like we have here. So I don't think that tariffs and things like that will impact our sector. Now, it actually has psychologically had a huge impact on equity valuation. So the average Chinese biopharmaceutical stock is down 30 to 40% over the last 4 or 5 months. So it's impacted their entire stock market, and this sector included. So that's one half of the trade war that I think will eventually be resolved and worked out. Now, the thing that worries me a lot is how the U.S. administration right now is thinking about cross-border investment. So you might have heard of the changes that are happening at CFIUS right now, which is a committee within the Treasury Department that rules on foreign investments. Biotech is starting to get roped into that in a big way, and it's already impacting how Chinese venture capital firms are investing in the U.S. And I'd like to kick it over to Guillaume and then Jonathan to get their thoughts and see if this is impacting their business at all from like a licensing standpoint or a partnering standpoint, because that's something that can impact all of the listeners on this call in a big way. So maybe Guillaume, I'll kick it off to you and see how the headlines of that and the changes that are happening are affecting your business today, if they are at all.
So it does, and it is affecting our business today, in a sense that when we are building a very large manufacturing plant in Guangzhou, 24,000 liter scale biologic manufacturing capabilities, and we had some equipment being shipped from the US, and the tag price was from one day to the other very, very different. Does it change our appetite to order the best equipment we could get for that facility? Of course not, as everything we want to do is to ensure a very high quality, but it's more expensive. So it is affecting our business in that sense. I don't see yet any other impact when it comes to, let's say, interactions with the FDA or interaction with the clinical sites in the US, when we investigators in the US or patients. I don't see also any impact in our capabilities to do deals as we have demonstrated. We can do deal across borders beyond China. So I don't see yet any impact from the let's say the business development side, but from the operations, supply, let's say procurement, definitely there's an impact, and it costs more to import things from the US.
How about you, Jonathan? Are you seeing any impact in terms of Zai's business and your ability to do business development in the United States?
Yeah, so on the two components of the potential impacts due to a trade war, I think on the tariff side, I think the impact is minimal, if any. I think on the CFIUS side also, the impact as of now is zero. So everything is business as usual. We have consulted a number of experts in this area. Of course, there are still components that's still to be determined. But based on these experts, these councils' current advice, I think they will probably narrow the definition because it doesn't make sense for certain part, biotech to be included as part of the CFIUS, or the export control review. I think because fundamentally, we are bringing, medicine to patients. There should be no defense or other agendas here. And if the U.S. government ultimately through these new rules, trying to limit, these professional business that we're doing, and what we're doing is actually in many ways trying to help the U.S. companies not only to access a large market, but also more importantly to help them develop drugs and accelerate their timeline globally. If our ability to help these companies, as a result of Trump's certain new rules, that would be very, very unfortunate for the patient population globally, not only in China but also in the United States. So I think as we see it now, it's still business as usual.
Okay, great, thank you. So let me just follow up with that. The questions, the trade war. I mean, what else is there that could potentially be a barrier for the continued growth of Chinese biotechs? Specifically Zai and BeiGene. What are some risks that you have to really, contend with other than the trade war? I guess Jonathan, we can continue with you.
Yeah. So look, I think the potential risks would be for I guess any of the markets. I think China no different in terms of potential reimbursement prices, how that plays out. In terms of the reform, whether they'll continue to go deep and broad, to accelerate the introduction of these innovative medicine. I think, as Brad, kicked off the panel with his comments, I think the reform and the conviction from the government is very much, strong and real, sweeping, and I think, for the longevity. So I think, there is going to be continuous changes, continuous encouragements, and continuous potentially new policies released to accelerate the introduction of new medicine, to this country. So I think that is definitely, a good thing for the patients. What is maybe through the trade war, what is maybe through reimbursement. Sometimes it is hard to predict, but I think, over the long term, I certainly see that, it's definitely a very rosy industry, for companies that is really built to last here.
Thank you. Guillaume?
I think the fundamentals are very strong. And, just to echo what you've said in your introduction, James, is, 2 years ago, people were sitting in a room complaining that, all of those hurdles to run clinical trials in China, that, it was taking a lot of time. So everybody was complaining about that. And in a year to 18 months, I mean, all of those pain points have been addressed. So I think, nobody should underestimate basically the ability the Chinese government to implement, successfully important reforms. And as we have seen, those reforms are definitely creating a very favorable regulatory environment that is good for the patients in China. And I think, as Brad mentioned, also for patients worldwide, has clinical trials being run in China are eligible to be part of global studies, and it's basically also very strong rationale for partnering with a Chinese partner who's able to enroll quickly at a very high quality, patients in clinical studies in China that could be used to boost and accelerate global clinical development. So, we were talking and alluding to the finance as well, financing environment, which is still favorable today, even though there's nowhere in the world free lunch. You still need to do your homework and have quality asset to get some very good investments. But favorable regulatory environment, some strong somehow ability to raise funding, some very good science. We didn't talk about that, but very, very strong science in China. We're always thinking about China as a place to bring externally developed drugs and import those drugs for China. But we have multiple examples in China about how innovation from within China is impacting the rest of the world. And at Beijing, fortunately, we have a couple of examples to that. So innovation, funding, and the favorable market conditions somehow still. And I should add talents, so people. We have a lot of people, returning from their PhDs to China because they see that China is a very attractive place to innovate and conduct their research. So I think China is a very nice place to be, and it's certainly going to significantly impact the way we are looking at our industry overall. Again, the ability to use data generated in Chinese patients to accelerate global programs is certainly a very, very meaningful value proposition to anyone running clinical trials nowadays.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely there's a lot of opportunities in China, but with the recent priority review path that was set up for 48 global market assets to enter the Chinese market, how is that actually affecting how Chinese biotechs are feeling about the lowering of barrier to entry into China? With the increase of clinical trials, being able to leverage international trials also. It makes it a lot easier for other large pharma to enter also, not just other biotechs. So how are you guys viewing this kind of decreasing of barrier to entry?
I'll quickly start. This is Brad. I just have a quick comment on that. When that news came out, so that was announced in August when they issued that letter. A lot of people, on social media and talking to folks, thought that would be a bad thing for the domestic players, to have all these multinationals and these really, world-class drugs flooding the market. I think it's the opposite. I think a rising tide lifts all boats. And the biggest change that I've seen, especially over the last year or so, is a lot of the domestic players, who were previously entirely focused on generics and not innovation, are now getting into that. Fosun Pharma, for example, has a huge partnership with Kite and CAR-T. This is a generic company. This is like a Mylan of China, and now they're getting into the most innovative thing there is, cell therapy. And so I think that by inviting all of these world-class drugs onto the market, I think it's going to be good for everyone because it's going to raise the bar of competition and it's going to move all of the traditional domestic players into the innovation corner. And so I think it's going to, over the long term, be good for pretty much everybody. I don't know, Guillaume, how about you? What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with what you've said. I mean, we should not underestimate the fact that, large pharmas have been operating in China for, some of them, decades. And some of them are still valuing partnering with a Chinese partner. And there's probably some reasons for that. Some reasons, maybe coming from the size of the organizations. For those of you who know China, who have been to China, it's still very complex and it's a very large territory, and it's not a walk in the park to operate in this environment. So I think someone whose raison d'être is really China, and who has the focus and the deep understanding of China and the different provinces, when it comes also to market access, pricing, reimbursement, I think Jonathan already alluded to that, is definitely very valuable to even large pharmas, to have really a subset of people fully dedicated to these topics for years.
Jonathan?
Yeah, look, I think absolutely agree with Brad and Guillaume on their points. I think if you look at the Western companies that have been successful in China, the multinationals, and it's not all multinationals that have been successful in China, by the way, but the ones that have been successful have really invested in China for decades, right? Even sort of in the 80s, early 90s, these companies have come in and gradually through a long time build up the platform and the commercial presence that they have now. So I think it would be very difficult for us, for example, to convince BMS to let us commercialize their Opdivo. But then at the same time, there are countless number of smaller to medium-sized biotech companies who, very quite frankly, they've never really even thought about China, at least from a development point of view, let alone from a commercial perspective. So for these companies to, all of a sudden, even though China's opening up, to think about China, to build a presence, it's still very challenging because, as Guillaume said, China is very diverse, very different. There's some 30-odd provinces, and each province is almost like a country. So it's not that simple, to establish something here, overnight.
Oh, thank you. So I now want
sorry. To go one step further, and definitely what we see is more and more, let's say, conversations biotech to biotech, as biotech realized that doing early collaboration with a Chinese company could really bring the clinical development expertise that maybe they don't have yet fully fleshed out, while addressing already a very big part of the world. As I mentioned, you could generate data in China that is eligible to accelerate your clinical development study worldwide. So if you really have strong partner in China who has the capabilities, the expertise, the track record to enroll quickly some patients with very high quality in the management of the data, that is a very attractive value proposition. And I think we see more and more of biotech exploring this venue rather than partnering early global rights with large multinational companies. So I think there's a lot of activities biotech created by this ability to leverage what is happening in China.
That's a great point. All right. Yeah, so I think that's a great point. I think that's a great segue, actually, Guillaume, to talk a little bit about what is the interest of Chinese biotech investing right now in other assets. What are you looking for in licensing deals? What kind of assets? Are you looking for these super innovative products that are mainly for the Chinese population? Looking at specific, in oncology, it would be specifically the major indications that are most prevalent in China, or are you looking at these, as Brad mentioned, what Fosun did with Kite, some super innovative cell therapy, or very high risk but potential high reward kind of assets. So maybe we start with Guillaume. Since you brought the topic, we'll talk a little bit about what your interest is.
Sure. And Guillaume, real quick, like one thing one way you might want to frame it too is you have an audience of people, from U.S. companies that are exactly in the situation that you just described. They've been solely focused on the domestic market here and maybe Europe, and they're hearing about these things, but, don't really know where to start to even think about getting involved or how to go about it. So what advice do you have for those people?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So let me try to share my experience. So I had some people coming to us interested somehow by tapping into the clinical development capabilities, commercial and manufacturing capabilities of Beijing, but with a little bit of concerns that doing a deal early would somehow affect their the valuation of their global for the future global assets. And the way I answered those concerns were, well, if you have a partner beyond the dollar amount, and I think the deal with press release yesterday shows that actually in terms of valuation we can definitely pay market price for doing deals, but beyond the dollar amount, again the value proposition to have a partner with 600 people in clinical development who's able to recruit patients in China quickly at very high quality when it comes to the management of the data is a very meaningful and powerful value proposition, because you can regain ownership or leadership position versus competition. And nowadays we know that even if you have a very nice target, there's the chance that you have other competitors working on the same target is very high. It could also help you to regain a leadership position, not just to keep it, but to regain it versus your competitors. So I think it's a very interesting value proposition, and when you articulate that to companies who have those concerns regarding their valuation, I think there's a lot of traction into that story. Going back to the question on what we are looking for, we are looking at, of course, innovation, and the definition of innovation may have a very, very different meanings depending on who you're talking to. So sometimes traditionally people have been a bit shy to go into innovation that they believe would not pay out because it was too risky or too costly. And I think again, because of the different cost structure in China, you can run and be courageous by doing this type of head-to-head trials versus very well entrenched assets. So that's one point. In terms of therapeutic areas, we are looking at oncology, immuno-oncology. We are very strong in heme. We are commercializing 3 products in China ourselves with our own commercial sales force. So any product that could be, let's say, already commercialized outside of China or in the very late stage of development outside of China is of interest. Again, we can definitely do early stage deals as we have demonstrated recently, and then we can contribute to accelerate clinical development worldwide. But we are also looking at enabling technologies that could support our research efforts in the long run. We are looking at also maybe other therapeutic areas of interest to go beyond oncology, immuno-oncology, and hematology. Very broad scope.
So the same question to Jonathan now. Do you have your thoughts on what Zai's position is?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, we have done a quite diverse set of deals. We have done deals for global rights, very innovative assets. We have done deals that are, commercial stage innovative assets. We have done deals, through various stages of clinical development, for different regional rights. So, we've really positioned ourselves as the partner of choice, the gateway into China, since the founding of the company. So licensing is definitely a core part of our, partnering is a core part of our strategy, in addition to, of course, our own in-house discovery efforts. In terms of the specific types of assets we look for, I think, first of all, it has to be relevant to the China market. And by that, not at all assets, if it has even blockbuster potential, in the United States, may meet that criteria. Because China today still, largely, whether self-pay or reimbursement, the price realization, the ASP, is substantially lower than in the United States. So if it's a rather orphan indication, there's not too many patients in China, it will be difficult, to make your, even your upfront and some of those payments back, looking at some of the deals. So, for us, there has to be, significant patient population, significant unmet medical need. Of course, the later stage, the better, so that you're really de-risked with that asset. So things with proof of concept data, things, that are very late stage, obviously, is better. But at the same time, we are willing to take risks. We have a very strong scientific, R&D team that looks very deep, in the due diligence phases. And so we have done a number of deals with, even preclinical assets, where we partnered, with the Western companies, really trying to accelerate their development in China and globally. So maybe I'll stop there.
That's terrific, and I think a great follow-up question here to what you guys have been talking about in your interest in trying to get partners and what kind of partners would find benefit is, there's a worry that, there's sort of a cultural difference potentially in alliance management and also what type of partnerships will be at stake when you're dealing with a Chinese company, whether there's a need that they're giving up board control or financial spending or anything like that. Could you guys kind of comment a little bit on that, Guillaume?
Actually, it's going to be a very short answer. We don't see any impact on the, let's say, cultural differences in the way we are managing alliance management, which objective by definition is to make sure that the vision of the partnerships beyond managing the contract is still implemented. So it's all about, operations while dealing with science. So there's always something wrong going into, recruitment or a site or a patient or something, and you need to be reactive and you need to proactively manage this. Again, the focus is on operational excellence, execution. So you hope to minimize the overall risk of running clinical trials by minimizing the operational risk. So if you could do that very well within the framework of the alliance with your partner, both partners are basically winning. And again, on the type of deals that we are doing where it's really a collaboration, the data generated outside of China benefits what we do in China and vice versa. You need to have a very, very close collaboration and relationship. So again, from what I've seen at Beijing, there's no impact on cultural differences.
Thank you. And Jonathan?
Yeah, so we obviously have very collaborative styles, and different companies you work with, sometimes the culture is different. But we have done a lot of deals, and we have been doing deals, since the establishment of the company, and also in Samantha's previous company, in Hutchison Chi-Med, when she built that, more than 18 years ago. They had been doing a lot of out partnering, at that time as well, where they really out-licensed a lot of the drugs to the, multinationals. So a lot of people join her, in this company, and we carry on that collaborative style with whether biotechs or multinationals. English is the standard language, within our company. We also, have the right critical mass, across the entire value chain, from drug discovery, development, to commercialization. Yet at the same time, we operate more like a biotech. So our decision-making process is very streamlined, very efficient. So, I think, at least from the alliance management communication, problem-solving perspective, I think that's certainly one of our strengths, because of the track record that we've had.
Thanks. And I think, just the, last few minutes, I mean, we're already past the top of the hour. We have probably 5-10 minutes left. And people are already, answering to do their next meetings. But let's just, ask the final question, I think, for everyone here. If you're on the U.S. or Western side, or even from your side, perspective-wise, how are you finding each other, for partnering? Is it necessary for a Western company to go to China in order to learn about who to partner with? Because you guys are interested, obviously, in partnering, but how can they find you? And also, how are you finding them? Because there's a whole world out there of players. How are you selecting them?
So I think,
I
I think you at least know two of them, over this panel. But, I think if it's an important asset, for the US or European company, and if you can find the time, I definitely encourage a visit to, China, to meet the potential partners, and you probably, would have made a short list of, potential companies by the time you get here. But definitely meet them, talk to the people, see their facilities, see how real it is, see if they do have the track record, let them speak about the case studies and the execution, and then compare. I think you really need to see it to first understand, the market potential, the development capabilities, and then, to really understand each of the potential partners. Because, especially where you're doing co-development, collaborative efforts, it's a marriage. And so before you sign the deal document, you really want to meet the people, not only the business development people, but you want to meet the people that you're going to be working day to day with. They're not even the EVPs or the heads of the departments, but really the people beneath them that's going to be talking with your team on a day-to-day basis. I think it's really important, if you can make that, visit possible.
Right. Guillaume?
Absolutely. I mean, Jonathan said it all. I would just maybe add, you can always hear, read, watch what's happening in China, but seeing it with your own set of eyes will definitely change your perspective about China. So in addition to what Jonathan said, which is very much true, you need to make sure you know your partner, that you have a chance to interact with the people with whom you are going to be closely interacting on an almost everyday basis is paramount to me. But again, looking at the infrastructures of the countries, meeting some of the KOLs, hospitals in very different provinces, maybe not just the usual places where you would go, I think is a very good eye opener. So I really encourage people to do that kind of road trip across China to visit different provinces, different hospitals, meet with KOLs. This is truly amazing. I mean, you meet KOLs who are somehow never invited to do a plenary session at ASCO, who are actually treating literally thousands of patients, and they have immense knowledge and experience at running clinical trials. So really, I also encourage interactions with KOLs in China, not just the companies.
Yeah, and this is Brad. Something that I would add to both of those comments is, in China, the life sciences sector, especially over the most recent year or two, has gone through a boom. And when you go through a boom, you have a lot of companies that are created overnight. And what I would recommend to U.S. companies looking to partner there is you can't, like, the scale of this business in general can't be won overnight, but especially in a company or in a country like China where the scale is just so immense. You know, as both of the speakers said, every region is like a country there. You know, imagine if you were new to the United States and like every single state was totally unique to this business. You would want to partner with somebody that's been doing this for many years, not somebody that just kind of put together a slide deck and said they want to be the licensor of choice. And, you know, we have two companies on the call today that have been doing this for a long time, and they've been building up, you know, the expertise and the footprint in establishing all of these relationships. And that's super important. And so as a lot of us in the US are new to this, I would try to separate out the companies that have been there and like truly know the country intimately, and the ones that are, you know, new startups, because as we know in the US biotech sector, it takes years to really establish yourself as a biotech company, and especially in a country that large, with so many changes going on, even more so. So I would recommend that, you know, partners really look to the companies that have been there and done that, and, you know, have already been making investments for many years, you know, rather than kind of a new startup overnight, of which there's dozens and dozens, like, you know, cropping up right now. So I think that's a really important element.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone on the panel. I just want to give Brad to give some final thoughts on this panel, and then, you know, appreciate everyone's time.
Yeah, my final thought, I just go back to what I said before. I think that China biotech is like US biotech in the 90s. I think that there's wide open space for a ton of indications. A couple weeks ago, I was meeting with the CEO of Ascletis, which was the first company that IPO'd in Hong Kong, and they're kind of like a Gilead type company. They do antivirals like hepatitis C and HIV, and they're getting into NASH and things. And, you know, I asked him, I was like, well, why did you return to China to start this company? And he had a really cool anecdote. He was working in the US, and he saw the Gilead Pharmaset deal, which was, you know, $9 billion for, at that time, a phase 2 asset. And he said, I looked at that, and I looked at China, and there wasn't a single trial going on for an innovative new hepatitis C treatment. And we have the most hepatitis C patients in the entire world. So, you know, that's a great investment opportunity, and they're wide open spaces in that market still for many things like that. And so I just think, again, that there's a handful of really important elements coming together. I view this as like, you know, a really unique time and potentially an inflection point. And the early adopters are going to be the ones that are rewarded the most. So I think it's great that, you know, we had so many people sign up for this webinar, and there's so much interest in it. And I think you are the early adopters who are thinking about this now. And so I would encourage everyone to pursue this market aggressively, because when I think about it, you know, in the 2025 timeframe and over the long term, I think it can really be an exciting market, and this is just the very beginning of it.
Thank you, Brad. And for Jonathan and Guillaume, do you guys have final thoughts? Jonathan?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, just to echo, I think some of the key points, you know, that we've sort of talked about. I think, you know, China, definitely there's significant changes. I think if you want to come into China, you know, really, you know, take some time, please, to do the due diligence, you know, talk to the different parties, and hopefully, you know, we can, you know, be partners and, you know, do something together, because I think there's a lot of ways China can contribute from a global development perspective, not only from, you know, just the market access.
Thank you. Guillaume?
It's difficult to be the last one, right? Everything has been said. Again, I would encourage really people who are maybe not so familiarized with China to come to China, to visit some companies, and really, as Jonathan and Brad mentioned, to consider China as part of the global ecosystem and see how China could contribute to accelerate some of their clinical development. efforts. So definitely an exciting place, and I agree, more to come.
Thank you. And on behalf of Cello Health BioConsulting, I want to thank all the panelists from calling all the way from China to Europe and in the US, and all the attendees that are also globally for attending. I appreciate your time this morning, evening, afternoon, whatever it may be, and we'll look forward to you joining our future webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, all.
Thanks all.
Thank you.